Large-scale industrialization, immigration, and urban expansion changed the United States dramatically during the last quarter of the 19th century. By the turn of the century, a reform movement had developed that included a wide range of groups and individuals with a common desire to improve life in the industrial age. Their ideas and work became known as Progressivism because they wanted to build on the existing society, making moderate political changes and social improvements through government action. Most progressives were not revolutionaries, but shared the goals of limiting the power of big business, improving democracy for the people, and strengthening social justice. Achieving these goals often included a more active role for the federal government. Although the progressive movement had its origins in the state reforms of the early 1890s, it acquired national momentum only with the dawn of a new century and the unexpected swearing into office of a young president, Theodore Roosevelt, in 1901. The progressive era lasted through the Republican presidencies of Roosevelt, Taft, and the first term of Democrat Woodrow Wilson. U.S. entry into World War I in 1917 diverted public attention away from domestic issues and brought the era to an end, but not before major regulatory laws had been enacted by Congress and various state legislatures. As they entered a new century, most Americans were well aware of rapid changes in their country. The relatively homogeneous rural society of independent farmers of the past was transforming into an industrialized nation of mixed ethnicity centered in the growing cities. For decades, middle-class Americans had been alarmed by the rising power of big business. They've also been alarmed by the uncertainties of business cycles and the increasing gap between rich and poor. The violent conflict between labor and capital and the dominance of corrupt political machines in the cities was also very disturbing to Americans. Most disturbing to minorities were the racist Jim Crow laws in the South that relegated African Americans to the status of second-class citizens. Crusaders for women's suffrage added their voices to the call for greater democracies. The groups participating in the progressive movement were extremely diverse. Protestant church leaders championed one set of reforms. African Americans proposed other reforms. Union leaders sought public support for their goals, and feminists lobbied their state legislatures for votes for women. Loosely linking these reform efforts under a single label, progressive, was a belief that society badly needed changes and that government was the proper agency for correcting social and economic ills. Unlike the populists of the 1890s, whose strength came from rural America, most progressives were middle-class men and women who lived in cities. The urban middle class had steadily grown in the final decades of the 19th century. In addition to doctors, lawyers, ministers, and storekeepers, thousands of white-collar office workers and middle managers employed in banks, manufacturing firms, and other businesses formed a key segment of the economy. Members of this business and professional middle class took their civic responsibilities seriously. Some were versed in scientific and statistical methods and the findings of the new social sciences. They belonged to the hundreds of national business and professional associations that provided platforms to address corrupt business and government practices. A missionary spirit inspired some middle-class reformers. Protestant churches preached against vice and taught a code of social responsibility, which included caring for the less fortunate and insisting on honesty in public life. The social gospel, which was popularized by Walter Rauschenbusch, if you remember back from our previous lesson, was an important element in Protestant Christians' response to the problem of urban poverty. Most of these Protestants were native-born and older stock Americans, often from families of older elites who felt that their central role in society had been replaced by wealthy industrialists and urban political machines. Without strong leadership, the diverse forces of reform could not have overcome conservatives' resistance to change. Fortunately for the Progressives, a number of dedicated and able leaders entered politics at the turn of the century to challenge the status quo. Theodore Roosevelt and Robert La Follette in the Republican Party, and William Jennings Bryan and Woodrow Wilson in the Democratic Party, demonstrated a vigorous style of political leadership that had been lacking from the national politics during the Gilded Age. The reform impulse was hardly new. In fact, many historians see progressivism as just one more phase in a reform tradition going back to the Jeffersonians in the early 1800s. Without doubt, the progressives, like American reformers before them, were committed to democratic values and shared in the belief that honest government and just laws could improve the human condition. A revolution in thinking occurred at the same time as the Industrial Revolution. Charles Darwin, in his Origin of the Species, presented the concept of evolution, which had an impact well beyond simply justifying the accumulation of wealth. If you can remember back to our previous lesson when we talked about social Darwinism. The way people thought and reasoned was challenged by Darwin, and that prevailing philosophy of romantic transcendentalism in America gave way to a balanced pragmatism. In the early 20th century, William James and John Dewey were two leading American advocates for this new philosophy. They defined truth in a way that many progressives found appealing. James and Dewey argued that the good and the true could not be known in the abstract as fixed and changeless ideals. Rather, they said, people should take a pragmatic or practical approach to morals, ideals, knowledge. They should experiment with ideas and laws and test them in action until they found something that would produce a well-functioning democratic society. Progressive thinkers adopted the new philosophy of pragmatism because it enabled them to challenge fixed notions that stood in the way of reform. For example, they rejected laissez-faire theory as impractical. The old standard of rugged individualism no longer seemed viable in a modern society dominated by impersonal corporations. Another idea that gained widespread acceptance among progressives came from the practical studies of Frederick Winslow Taylor. By using a stopwatch to time the output of factory workers, Taylor discovered ways of organizing people in the most efficient manner, the scientific management system. Many progressives believed that government, too, could be made more efficient if placed in the hands of experts and scientific managers. They objected to the corruption of political bosses, partly because it was the anti-democratic and partly because it was an inefficient way to run things. Before the public could be roused to action, it first had to be well informed about the scandalous realities of politics, factories, and slums. Newspaper and magazine publishers found that their middle-class readers loved to read about underhanded schemes in politics. Therefore, many publications featured in-depth investigative stories. Writers specializing in such stories were referred to as muckrakers by President Theodore Roosevelt. One of the earliest muckrakers was Chicago reporter Henry Lloyd, who in 1881 wrote a series of articles for the Atlantic Monthly attacking the practices of the Standard Oil Company against the railroads. This was published in book form in 1894 and called Wealth Against Commonwealth, and it fully exposed the corruption and greed of the oil monopoly, but failed to suggest how to control it. An Irish immigrant, Samuel Sidney McClure, founded McClure's magazine in 1893. This became a major success by running a series of muckraking articles by Lincoln Steffens called The Tweed Days in St. Louis, and another series by Ida Tarbell called The History of the Standard Oil Company. These articles combined careful research with sensationalism, and so they set a standard for the deluge of muckraking that followed. Popular 10 and 15-cent magazines like McClure's and Cosmopolitan competed fiercely to outdo their rivals with shocking exposés of political and economic corruption. The most popular series of muckraking articles were usually collected and published as best-selling books. Articles on tenement life by Jacob Riis, one of the first photojournalists, were published in How the Other Half Lives. The popularity of muckraking books and magazine articles began to decline after 1910 for several reasons. First, writers found it more and more difficult to top the sensationalism of the last story. Second, publishers were expanding and faced economic pressures from banks and advertisers to tone down their treatment of business. Third, by 1910, corporations were becoming more aware of their public image and developing a new specialty, the field of public relations. Nevertheless, muckraking had a lasting effect on the Progressive era. It exposed inequities, educated the public about corruption in high places, and prepared the way for corrective action. The cornerstone of progressive ideology was faith in democracy. Progressives believed that given a chance, the majority of voters would elect honest officials instead of the corrupt ones backed by boss-dominated political machines. Progressives advocated a number of reforms for increasing the participation of the average citizen in political decision-making. Political parties could manipulate and intimidate voters by printing lists or tickets of party candidates and then watching voters drop them into the ballot box on election day. In 1888, Massachusetts was the first state to adopt a system successfully tried in Australia of issuing ballots printed by the state and requiring voters to mark their choices secretly within a private booth. By 1910, all states had adopted the secret ballot. In the late 19th century, Republicans and Democrats commonly nominated candidates for state and federal offices in state conventions that were dominated by party bosses. In 1903, the progressive governor of Wisconsin, Robert La Follette, introduced a new system for bypassing politicians and placing the nominating process directly in the hands of voters, the direct primary. By 1915, some form of the direct primary was used in every state. The system's effectiveness in overthrowing boss rule was limited, as politicians still devised ways of confusing the voters and splitting the anti-machine vote. Some southern states even used white-only primaries to exclude African Americans from voting. Traditionally, U.S. senators had been chosen by the state legislatures rather than by the direct vote of the people. Progressives believed this was a principal reason that the Senate had become a millionaires' club dominated by big business. Nevada in 1899 was the first state to give the voters the opportunity to elect U.S. senators directly. By 1912, a total of 30 states had adopted this reform. And in 1913, adoption of the 17th Amendment required that all U.S. senators be elected by popular vote. If politicians in the state legislatures balked at obeying the will of the people, then progressives proposed two methods for enforcing them to act. Amendments to state constitutions offered voters the initiative, which was a method by which voters could compel the legislature to consider a bill, and the referendum, which was a method that allowed citizens to vote on proposed laws printed on their ballots. A third progressive measure, the recall, enabled voters to remove a corrupt or unsatisfactory politician from office by majority vote when that official's term had expired. City bosses and their corrupt alliance with local businesses, like trolley lines and utility companies, for example, were the first target of progressive leaders. In Toledo, Ohio, in 1897, a self-made millionaire with strong memories of his origins as a working man became the Republican mayor. Adopting Golden Rule as both his policy and his middle name, Samuel M. Golden Rule Jones delighted Toledo's citizens by introducing a comprehensive program of municipal reform, including free kindergartens, night schools, and public playgrounds. Reform leaders arose in other cities throughout the nation, seeking to break the power of the city bosses and take utilities out of the hands of private companies. By 1915, fully two-thirds of the nation's cities owned their own water systems. As a result of the progressives' efforts, Many cities also came to own and operate gas lines, electric power plants, and urban transportation systems. New types of municipal governments were another progressive innovation, like commissions and city managers.